Do you know what your problem is, Ella?
No. Why don't you tell me?
You've broken so many hearts that you forgot one day someone might break yours.
That will never happen.
That's exactly what every broken man thought before they met you.
Ryan Brooks had loved Ella Carter for years, but Ella was a woman who didn't believe in love. She had spent her entire life watching relationships fall apart, and because of that, she had slowly, quietly, deliberately become the very thing she feared most, someone who couldn't be touched. And for a long time, she told herself that was strength. She was wrong. Ella Carter grew up in a house that looked like happiness from the outside. Large gates, a wide driveway, fresh flowers delivered every Monday morning. The kind of home that made neighbors say, that family has everything. But inside that house, two people were quietly falling apart. Her father, Michael Carter, was a warm man, a laughing man, the kind of father who told terrible jokes at the dinner table and meant every single one of them. Her mother, Victoria, was polished and precise, beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, carefully maintained and impossible to get close to. They had loved each other once. Ella had seen photographs. Young Victoria laughing with her whole face. Young Michael holding her like he was afraid she might disappear. But by the time Ella turned 15, the laughing had stopped. She would lie in bed at night listening to the silence between her parents, which was somehow louder than any argument. There were no screaming matches in the Carter household, no broken plates, just two people sitting in the same room like strangers waiting for a bus, both pretending not to notice how long the bus was taking. When Ella was 18, Michael Carter packed his things on a quiet Tuesday afternoon and left. He didn't slam the door, he didn't say anything dramatic. He simply walked out with 2 suitcases, got into a car, and drove away. A year later, he remarried. His new wife was softer, more open. She smiled easily and laughed at the same terrible jokes that Victoria had grown tired of years before. Ella watched all of it and said nothing. But Victoria said plenty. In the months after Michael left, Victoria reinvented herself. She traveled, she built her business into something twice the size it had been. She bought a new penthouse and filled it with art and silence and the kind of expensive things that asked nothing of you. And slowly, deliberately, she began teaching her daughter the only lesson she believed in. Love is for fools, she would say, adjusting her pearls in the mirror. Money stays. Love leaves. Remember that, Ella, always. And Ella, who was 18 and hot, and watching her father build a new life with someone who wasn't her mother, filed that lesson somewhere deep in her chest, where it hardened like stone. By the time she finished university, she had become exceptional at 2 things: succeeding and not needing anyone. She was brilliant. Everyone said so. Sharp mind, sharper tongue, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately became the most interesting person in it without appearing to try. She was also, undeniably, beautiful. Not in a soft or approachable way. In the way of something rare and slightly dangerous, like a piece of art you are not sure you are allowed to touch. Men fell for her constantly. She expected this and felt nothing about it. There was a pattern to it, and she knew the pattern well. A man would notice her, he would pursue her, she would allow just enough closeness to make him feel certain, and then, at the exact moment he began to believe in something real, she would pull back, calmly. Without cruelty, she always told herself. She never promised anyone anything. She never lied. She simply never loved them back. They fell anyway, and she watched them fall with the quiet detachment of someone who had already decided the ground wasn't safe. Her mother called it wisdom. Ella called it protection. Neither of them used the real word for it, which was fear. She joined Brooks International at 26, brought in as a senior strategist on the strength of a portfolio that had made 3 different companies significantly richer. It was a clean, prestigious move, the kind her mother approved of, with a single nod and the words, "Good, now don't let anyone distract you." What Victoria didn't know, and what Ella herself barely registered at first, was that she had been in the same university building as Ryan Brooks for almost 2 full years. Different circles, occasional glimpses in corridors, a face she had filed away without meaning to, somewhere in the back of her memory where unremarkable things went. Ryan had not forgotten her. He had noticed her on a Wednesday afternoon in their 2nd year, when she had walked into a lecture hall alone, sat 3 rows from the front, and proceeded to ask a question so precise that the professor had paused to think before answering. Ryan had been sitting near the window. He had watched her with the quiet, focused attention of someone who understood that they were looking at something worth remembering. He had never spoken to her in university. He was careful that way, deliberate about the things he wanted, unwilling to rush toward them. But he had not forgotten her face. So when Ella Carter walked into the main conference room at Brooks International on her first Monday morning, wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a leather portfolio like she already owned the room, Ryan had felt something shift quietly inside his chest. He didn't make a scene of it. He didn't approach her that day or the next. He simply watched and recognized and waited. That evening, leaving the office, he had seen her laughing with a male colleague in the lobby. The laugh was real, unguarded, surprised out of her by something genuinely funny, the kind of laugh a person gives before they remember to be careful. It lasted only a few seconds before she composed herself, but Ryan had seen it. He had turned away and said quietly to no one in particular, "One day, princess, you'll know what real love feels like." He meant it. He had no idea yet what it would cost him to mean it. Ryan's younger sister, Sophie, had none of her brother's patience. Where Ryan was measured, Sophie was immediate. Where Ryan moved carefully, Sophie moved like a river, quickly, in multiple directions at once, talking to everyone, delighted by everything, incapable of walking past someone who looked interesting without introducing herself. She noticed Ella within a week of Ella's arrival, and she made a decision the way Sophie always made decisions, fast, enthusiastically, and without asking whether the other person was ready. She wanted to be Ella's friend. Ella was not interested. She was polite about it. She was always polite. But she kept Sophie at the exact distance she kept everyone. Close enough to be pleasant, far enough to be safe. She deflected Sophie's lunch invitations. She gave brief, kind answers to Sophie's questions and then turned back to her work. She was the human equivalent of a beautiful room with the door locked. Sophie was not discouraged by this. Sophie, who had spent her whole life watching her brother love quietly and without reward, had developed a deep personal investment in stubborn optimism. She persisted, gently, cheerfully, without pressure. And slowly, over weeks that turned into months, something shifted. Ella began to leave the door open, just slightly. A shared lunch, a walk between buildings, a conversation that lasted longer than necessary. For the first time in years, Ella found herself enjoying another person's company without calculating the risk of it. Sophie had slipped past her defenses without Ella noticing, simply by refusing to be intimidated by them. Ryan watched this unfold from a careful distance. He was glad and he was worried in equal measure. He warned Sophie once, gently, Don't get too attached. She's not ready for that. And Sophie had looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes she'd had since childhood and said, maybe she's not who everyone thinks she is. Ryan hadn't answered because deep down he believed Sophie was right. There was a man named Jason at the company. Handsome in the obvious way. Confident in the way men are confident when they have never been told no by anyone worth hearing it from. He invited Ella to a weekend party at a friend's estate outside the city, and Ella accepted because parties were easy. They asked nothing of her. She could be present and absent at the same time. Sophie, with her characteristic lack of subtlety, announced that she was coming too. The party was everything these parties always were. Beautiful people in beautiful rooms, soft music and harder drinks, conversations that sounded important and meant nothing. Jason spent the entire evening near Ella, attentive and warm, making her laugh with stories she'd have heard before in different versions. He was kind. He was genuinely kind, and Ella recognized this, and it didn't change anything. Monday morning, Jason found her in the corridor before the first meeting. He was careful about it, not pushy. He was trying to be the kind of man worth keeping, and Ella could see that clearly, which made it worse. He talked about the weekend, suggested dinner, let the possibility of something more hover between them like a question waiting to be answered. Ella smiled the way she always smiled in these moments. Warm, final. There is no future, she said quietly. We just had fun. The sentence was gentle. It was also a wall, and Jason understood this instantly. The color left his face in the way color leaves a room when a light goes off. He nodded once and walked away. Ryan had been at the end of the corridor. He had not intended to hear it, but he had. And what moved through him wasn't sympathy for Jason exactly, though that was there too. What moved through him was something sharper, a kind of anger he hadn't expected, directed not at Ella, but at the pattern, at the wastefulness of it, at the way she reduced something genuine to a sentence and walked away clean while the other person carried the wreckage home. He made a decision that afternoon, standing in an empty corridor, watching Ella disappear around a corner. If she was going to understand love, she was going to have to feel its absence first. She was going to want something she couldn't simply take. He didn't plan it as revenge. It was never revenge. It was the only way he knew to reach her. The evening Sophie finally mentioned casually that Ryan was her brother. Ella had gone very still for a moment in the way people go still when something clicks into place that they've been trying to ignore. She had known there was something familiar about him. She had filed it away, kept it at arm's length, refused to examine it too closely. Now she understood why. Sophie was watching her with bright, amused eyes, and she added with the particular cheerfulness of someone who knows exactly what they are doing, "Stay away from my brother." The joke landed correctly. Ella laughed and said all the right things and went home that evening telling herself firmly that this changed nothing. Ryan Brooks was her employer, Sophie's brother, entirely irrelevant to her personal life. But something had shifted, and she knew it. She began noticing things she had been successfully not noticing. The way Ryan carried himself through a room, unhurried, certain, like someone who had nothing to prove and therefore didn't bother proving it. The way he listened when Sophie spoke in meetings with the particular quality of attention that meant he was actually hearing her and not simply waiting to respond. The way every other man she knew angled themselves toward her when she entered a room, and Ryan didn't. Ryan simply continued doing whatever he was doing and let her come to him or not, and appeared equally content with either outcome. This was new. This was deeply, disturbingly new. She didn't chase. She had never chased anyone in her life. She wasn't sure she knew how. Sophie invited her for a weekend at the family house, a quiet, comfortable place full of books and old furniture, and the particular warmth of a home where people have been genuinely happy. Ella accepted and told herself it was because she enjoyed Sophie's company, which was true. It was not the only truth. She was halfway through her second glass of wine that evening, sitting on Sophie's bed, talking about nothing in particular, when Ryan came home. She heard the front door, heard Sophie's voice carry down the stairs in greeting, heard his answer, brief, tired, the voice of someone at the end of a long day, and felt quite precisely and without permission her heartbeat change. She couldn't sleep. This happened to her sometimes, the particular restlessness of a mind that didn't know how to stop working. She lay in the dark for an hour and then gave up, pulled a cardigan over her shoulders and went downstairs for water. The kitchen light was already on. Ryan was sitting at the counter with a glass of water of his own, still in his work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then the conversation started, the way conversations start in the middle of the night when defenses are low and there's no audience to perform for. It was easy at first, then it became something else. Ryan put down his phone and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention she had been trying to not think about, and he said things no one had ever said to her. Not cruelty, precision. He named the pattern. He named what she did and what it cost the people she did it to. Calmly, without anger, the way a surgeon names a wound before treating it. She wanted to be furious with him. She was a little, but mostly she was shaking because no one had ever looked at her clearly enough to see what he was seeing or cared enough to say it out loud. And then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was brief and certain and completely unlike anything she had experienced before, because it wasn't a question and it wasn't a performance. It was a statement. And then he stepped back and looked at her with something in his eyes that was almost gentle and said, "Now, imagine how all those men felt." Then he walked away, calm as morning, and left her standing in his kitchen holding a glass of water she had forgotten she was holding. She stood there for a long time after he was gone. For the first time in her adult life, Ella Carter did not know what to do with what she was feeling. She avoided him. She was very good at avoiding people. She'd had years of practice. But Ryan was everywhere. The office, her phone, through business communications that were entirely professional, and somehow still managed to make her aware of him in a way that was inconvenient. Sophie's voice mentioning him casually in the way people mention someone who is simply part of the landscape of their life. She told herself it would pass. These things always passed. But this did not pass. She noticed with increasing discomfort that she had begun watching Ryan the way she was used to being watched. She noticed when women in the office found reasons to approach him. She noticed when he laughed, really laughed, freely, the way he did with Sophie or the older colleagues he'd known for years. She noticed when he wasn't in the room. Jealousy was not a feeling she recognized from personal experience. She had to sit with it for several days before she was sure that's what it was. And when she was sure, it frightened her more than she expected. She went home one evening, sat on her bed in her perfectly maintained apartment, and said it out loud to the empty room. Like a diagnosis she was finally ready to accept. "I think I'm falling for him." The silence that followed felt like the ground shifting. She did what she always did with things that frightened her. She moved towards them directly because Elakata did not hide from anything. That part was real, beneath all the walls. She was genuinely brave. She made her interest known, not desperately, not obviously, but clearly to anyone paying attention, and Ryan was always paying attention. He did not respond the way she expected. It was warm, it was present, it was everything it always been, but it kept a careful, specific distance between warmth and invitation, and it did not move toward her the way every other man had moved toward her the moment she showed any sign of welcome. She didn't understand this at first. She thought perhaps she had read the situation incorrectly, that the kiss had been a point made rather than a feeling expressed. The possibility stung in a way she wasn't prepared for. But then she began to see it differently, because Ryan wasn't cold. He wasn't pretending not to feel anything. She could see him feeling things, in the way he listened when they talked, in the particular quality of his attention, in the quiet care of small things she was only now learning to notice. He was simply waiting for something. She thought about it for a long time before she understood what he was waiting for. He was waiting for her to be ready. Not ready to be with him, ready to understand what being with someone actually meant. He had watched her move through relationships like seasons, present and then gone, and he loved her too much to become another person she walked away from when the weather changed. He wanted her whole, and he would wait until she could offer that. This understanding, when it arrived, broke something open inside her that she hadn't known was sealed. Victoria Carter found out. Ella had been careful, but Victoria had sharp eyes and a particular talent for reading her daughter, perhaps because they were more alike than either of them wanted to admit. She watched Ella's face during a dinner they shared one evening, and something in what she saw made her very still. The questions came afterwards, precisely aimed, and Ella, who was tired, who was changed, who had been sitting with a new kind of feeling for weeks and found it increasingly impossible to pretend otherwise, was less careful than she should have been. Victoria did not shout. She never shouted. But her silence afterward had an edge to it that Ella recognized from childhood, and it said, more clearly than words, "This is a problem I intend to solve." What Victoria did next, Ella didn't learn until weeks later, and when she did, she sat with the knowledge for a long time before she felt anything that resembled understanding. Victoria had gone to Ryan. Not confrontationally. Victoria didn't do things that way. She had arranged a meeting through business channels, made it seem professional, and then offered Ryan a figure of money that would have solved every problem his company was currently experiencing in exchange for removing himself from Ella's life, gracefully, cleanly, no mess. Ryan had refused. Victoria, who was not used to being told no by anyone, became determined in the way that people become determined when they mistake stubbornness for strength. She began using the considerable reach of her business connections to make things difficult for Brooks International. Not obviously, not directly, the kind of interference that looks like coincidence from the outside. A deal that falls through, a key partnership that quietly dissolves, an investor who suddenly develops reservations. Ryan's company began to suffer. He said nothing about this to Ella. He simply worked harder and absorbed the losses and continued, because he had not built what he built by stopping when things became difficult. Ella found out because Sophie told her, and Sophie told her because Sophie had watched it go on long enough and had a very clear sense of what was right and what wasn't. The conversation between Ella and her mother happened on a Sunday afternoon. It was the first real argument they had ever had, real in the sense of honest, real in the sense of saying things they had both spent years carefully not saying. Ella spoke first, calmly, and then less calmly, and then with a rawness that surprised them both. She said what Victoria had done was wrong. She said it was controlling. She said it was afraid. And she used that word deliberately because she had spent weeks learning what fear looked like, and she could see it clearly now in the set of her mother's jaw, in the practiced emptiness of her expression. Victoria stood very still and said nothing for a long time, and then she gave Ella the ultimatum that people give when they have no other tools left. "Choose him," she said, "or choose me." Ella looked at her mother for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I love you, but I am not going to become you." And she left. She did not go to Ryan that evening. She went to Sophie instead because she needed to understand something first. She had been carrying a question for weeks about where her mother came from, about how someone who once was capable of real love becomes a woman who treats it as a threat. Sophie knew some of it, and some of it Ella found on her own in old photographs in her mother's apartment that she had seen 100 times without really looking. Young Victoria, not the composed, armored Victoria of Ella's childhood, but an earlier version, softer at the edges, eyes that were open in a way they had not been for as long as Ella could remember. Her father had not been the first person to break her mother's heart. There had been someone before Michael, someone Victoria had loved completely and young, the way you love things before you've learned to protect yourself. And that person had left and had done it in a way that cost Victoria something she had never quite recovered. Michael had simply been the second proof of a lesson she had already decided was true. Ella sat with this for a long time. She thought about the mother who had raised her, precise, capable, armored, teaching her daughter to seal herself the same way she had sealed herself, out of love and out of fear in equal measure. She thought about the photographs. She thought about the way Victoria looked at men who were kind to Ella, with the particular wariness of someone who has been kind too and knows what kindness costs. She did not agree with what her mother had done. She would not undo her own choices to spare her mother's fear. But she understood. For the first time, she genuinely understood. And that understanding did something important. It showed her clearly what she did not want to become. Victoria had turned pain into a fortress and then mistaken the fortress for a life. Ella had been walking the same road. She was, she realized, still close enough to the beginning of it to turn around.